obviously, I've nearly completed the book after 30 years, so I'm beginning to feel a bit demob happy at last. But I must admit, the grinding of the last few months have been even slower than I thought it would be. Obviously, for us, the Russian Revolution's a seminal event, or the seminal event of the last century, and it's certainly for the working class it was. But there's no doubt that it's left us a very awkward legacy. And this, of course, is down to the way in which the working class in Russia went down to defeat itself. We've quoted this many times, but it was brilliantly summed up by Radek, who in April 1918 prophetically wrote, "If the Russian Revolution is crushed by the bourgeois counter-revolution, it will be reborn from its ashes like the phoenix. But if it loses its socialist character and by this disappoints the working masses, this blow will have 10 times more terrible consequences for the future of the Russian and international revolution." And I don't think anybody has put it better than that. A counter-revolution led by the same party that led the original assault on a capitalist state does take some assimilating. But the process hasn't been made any easier by the fact that we've had mutually reinforcing distortions of that history by both the heirs to Stalinism and the Western historians who have been intent on defending capitalism and therefore are denying any kind of credibility to the communist revolution that took place in 1917. And between them, they're just trying to efface the truth about what was really unique and revolutionary about what went on in Russia in 1917. It reminds me of what Orwell wrote in 1984, that they're acting on the premise that who controls the past controls the future, in the full knowledge that as they control the present, they dominate the message about what the past itself is. And well, in this respect, a worker's history has got to be something different, and it's not simply an academic investigation, but we are, in combating these false interpretations, making a contribution to our side in the class war itself. But rescuing the historical truth is not a simple task. As I've found out quite a lot while studying this, reality is intensely more complex and more messy than the kind of glib slogans that you get from ideologists. And I don't think any episode has been richer and more complex than the period between 1905 and 1918, which was the period of what I would call the rise of the revolution. Now, I've realized this is a very ambitious undertaking and it could be quite demanding of the listener. So I'm just going to try to, I'm not going to go blow by blow through everything, but I'm just going to try to focus on a few central issues. And starting with the first one, which is the Bolshevik argument that Russia was too backward a country to have a proletarian revolution, because I think this is quite a key point in dealing with a certain kind of way of misinterpreting Marxism. It's based on a failure to analyze the shift in capitalist relations as it moved into the epoch of imperialism. And this is one of the strengths of the Bolsheviks, or at least the strengths of Bukharin and Lenin, because they made the analysis during the First World War that capitalism had fundamentally changed. They clearly saw that the Russian Revolution could take a proletarian road, but that it would only do so as part of a worldwide workers' revolution. And this is I think this is the alpha and omega of the Russian Revolution. Everyone in Russia, right down to the most uneducated worker, back up to Rosa Luxemburg in the Polish party, they all understood that the question of socialism could not be answered in Russia alone. And I'm not going to mention this probably again in this introduction, but it was the continuing isolation of the revolution in Russia, which above all is the main explanation of why the revolution arrived at the cul-de-sac it did in 1921. However, when we're explaining what happened in the revolution, there were options about what was done. And these, I think, give us some idea about what should not be done in a future revolution. I mean, it's quite a difficult thing to take on, isn't it? That the same people who promoted a workers' revolution in the teeth of all kinds of adversity also became the agents of a new kind of state power. And this was, you know, quite a difficult thing for workers and the revolution to cope with. At the same time, several historians have argued that Lenin was actually taking a gamble. Alexander Rabinovich, for example, calls it a punt on this idea of world revolution, and because they argue that it was doomed from the start. But I think this is using what E.P. Thompson called the condescension of posterity, because in the time they were operating, capitalism couldn't have had a much more global crisis than an imperialist war, which had eventually engulfed all the great powers of the epoch and a lot of the minor countries as well. And there was no, to my mind, firmer material basis for believing that the common struggle against war would lead to an international movement of the working class. And in the end, at the end of the war, when the post-war revolutionary wave came, it was a close-run thing for capitalism. I mean, the revolutions in Germany, Austria-Hungary and Russia, they brought the world imperialist war to an end. And they brought the slaughter to an end. And there were mass movements in echoing this right across the world, from Seattle to Shanghai, of workers supporting the ideals of proletarian emancipation against the capitalist system of exploitation and bloodshed. And what saved capitalism was not its own inner strength or any kind of merit that it had, but the Social Democrats and trade unions who had betrayed the Second International in 1914. And they had then gone on to support, or at least failed to oppose, imperialism in the war. And in the post-war revolutionary wave, they rescued the system in its darkest hour by dividing the working class, or dividing the forces of the working class, and maintaining that there was a socialist alternative inside capitalism rather than the revolutionary one. The second challenge that I'd like to deal with, that I think, I don't think anybody else has ever written this, so I think it's unique to what I'm writing in the book, is the idea that the February Revolution was just a democratic or bourgeois revolution. Now, some people think this is quite controversial, because we know that the main actors at the time, including most Bolsheviks, thought that on the basis of a pre-existing theory that Russia had to take part first in have a democratic or bourgeois revolution before it could have a socialist revolution. But the actors at the time don't always see the reality of what's happening to them. And Marx points this out in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. Human beings, when they make history, they often dress up what they're doing in the clothes of the past. And they fail to acknowledge the really revolutionary aspect of the struggle that they're actually carrying out. And by looking at what really happened, the workers on the street in February, initially led by the women who came out, who couldn't stand the thought of another day of bread rationing cuts, they were the ones who brought about the downfall of the Tsar. It wasn't anybody else. Hundreds of them, over 1,000, perished before they managed to persuade the garrison of Petersburg to turn their guns on the police. And in those street demonstrations, which lasted over a week, the cry went up after about 4 days that why don't we reform the Soviets, that we had such an effective expression of the working class in 1905. Now, this was a cry that was being spread about on the streets, but it was also heard in the corridors of power. In the Tauride Palace, the Mensheviks and the right SRs were in discussion with monarchists and liberals about what should happen next. And the monarchists among them were saying, oh, we've got to do something because the scoundrels in the streets are going to set up their own power structures. And thus, the Mensheviks came, it was a part of the War Industries Committee, which was a body set up by the Tsar during the war to help the war effort, where the Mensheviks or certain socialists cooperated with employers to improve war production. The members of this, led by a man called Gvozdev, they suggested that why don't we form a Soviet to attract the workers to the Tauride Palace? And this is what they did. But the people on the streets, and this of course included most of the Bolsheviks, only heard about this at the last minute. And Shliapnikov turns up late in the evening to say, well, postpone it because we can't elect a delegation before then. And it's only then that the factories in Vyborg elect a delegation of about 70 to join this huge, vast body of a Soviet that has been set up by the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. And they, of course, they've got all their people in place, so they dominate the Soviet at the beginning of 1917. And they're the ones who promised to support the provisional government, which at the start was full of liberal monarchists, that they would give the support of the working class to that new body, which was totally unelected because the Duma hadn't been elected, and they were just a committee of the Duma that was made into the provisional government. So in effect, the bourgeoisie stole the Proletarian Revolution in February, and that's what really happened. And that also explains why throughout the rest of 1917, that movement continues. The provisional government go from one crisis to the next. In fact, we have 3 provisional governments. The one after another fall because either they're found to have a reactionary foreign minister like Milyukov, who tries to say that Russia is going to honor all its treaty obligations and take Constantinople off Turkey at the end of the war, which the proletariat come out in the street and demonstrate against, to finding out that all the other politicians are all engaged in some kind of way to undermine the Soviets. So gradually they have to keep reforming the provisional government, which is permanently in crisis throughout 1917. And the myth has gone around that, oh, the Bolsheviks played no part in the revolution. Well, they played a part on the streets. They played a part in the factories in Vyborg. They didn't play a great part in the negotiations at the beginning. And far from being marginal, the Bolsheviks already had a skeleton of an all-Russian organization. In fact, they were one of the few organizations in Russia that could claim to have somebody in just about every town in Russia. And this skeleton was what the class struggle of 1917 was given flesh by the actual workers themselves, who more and more saw that the Bolsheviks were the most unambiguous in their support for Soviet power, and more they went towards the Bolsheviks for that, in that fact. And this feeds into the question of the so-called Bolshevik coup d'etat of October, because the October Revolution is not like the February Revolution, where people are dying every few seconds, under the bullets of the police. The October Revolution passes off almost unnoticed in some places. I mean, the theatres carried on, the cinemas carried on, everything was still going. At the same time, the government was being overthrown. And it's a very strange thing. But it wasn't a simple coup, or if it was the most advertised coup in history, because after Zinoviev and Kamenev had published the fact that the Bolshevik Central Committee had voted in principle, and they never actually carried it out in practice, to overthrow the provisional government at Lenin's insistence, they finally voted to do it. They had published, of course, in Gorky's paper, Novaya Zhin, what had been discussed. So the government had a fortnight's notice that this was going to happen. And in fact, what Zinoviev and Kamenev did was they actually created the crisis for Kerensky, because now he had to try to move to try to get his side organized. And he was told he had troops available by the various people who were around him. But this turned out to be a chimera. They didn't exist. When he did move, he tried to close the bridges across the River Neva from the working class side into the center of the town. The Litieni Bridge and the Petropavlovsky Bridge, he tried to have them shut. He sent troops to do it, but found he was opposed by other troops that were loyal to the proletarian cause, as well as ordinary workers. And in the end, the troops that were sent to close the bridges were disarmed and prevented from stopping the working class getting into the city centre. And at the same time, Kerensky then decided to send another detachment to shut down the Bolshevik press. And this was the signal for the Military Revolutionary Committee to actually move, and they then moved to capture all the main parts of Petersburg to get control of it. And within 48 hours, they substantially controlled everything, and eventually took the Winter Palace in a rather, well, you know, the picture in Eisenstein shows them all climbing over the gates. Well, apparently there was a side gate that had a faulty lock on and they just walked in. But it's a, you know, it's gone down as quite a heroic event, which was probably a non-event. But the key thing that was happening, of course, was on the same day, the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which the Mensheviks and SRs had postponed and postponed and postponed. And in fact, they'd actually said, the Soviets are finished, we're going to stop them and just have a parliamentary system, even before the October Revolution. The second Congress now opened, and the delegates were assembling. It took a while for everybody to be accredited and everything, but when it came out, the Bolsheviks had just short of 50% of the delegates, with support from other delegates, non-party and the left SRs. They had a majority in the Soviet for declaring all power to the Soviets. There were attempts to make to form a broad socialist government, but these failed because the Mensheviks and SRs refused to accept Soviet power, and they walked out of the Congress. Well, they nearly all walked out. Some of them stayed. The left SRs later joined the Bolsheviks in government, and the Martov's Menshevik internationalists kept sort of storming out and then storming back in and storming out. So nobody was quite sure where they were for quite a while. But eventually they came back into the Soviet to act as a sort of minor opposition without ever accepting Soviet power. Now, of course, the next myth that we have to deal with is that the one that you see very frequently in anarchist publications and certainly in a lot of Western capitalist sources, which they always argue that as soon as they got into power, the Bolsheviks created a single-party dictatorship, emasculated the Soviets, and we had basically a police state from day one. This wasn't how it happened. Some historians like Hal Draper have pointed out that in the first 6 to 8 months of the revolution, there was a honeymoon period. Not only did the number of Soviets increase, but the actual functioning of the Soviets improved. The Bolsheviks, for example, passed a decree which meant that Soviets could be recalled, delegates could be recalled quickly and re-elected if that was what was required by any group of workers anywhere. And in this period, the first 100 days of the revolution, the so-called, all kinds of admirable social achievements were achieved. Officials had their wages reduced to that of the average wage of a skilled industrial worker. Church and state were separated. Freedom of religion was established, and that for Jewish people was a fantastic step forward. Free education alongside a mass literacy campaign was brought in. The church was removed from control of education, and the Soviet Union was the first nation in history to witness the spontaneous birth of communal organizations right across the whole country. And on top of that, divorce, abortion, and homosexuality were all legalized, which was, you know, unheard of at the time. Only the French Revolution had ever, for a short time, tried to have such progressive legislation. And a lot of this was happening not just because of what the Bolsheviks were doing, but because of they gave a lead. They had created a situation where people felt that they could actually do things themselves. Factory committees, cooperatives, communes, Soviets, there was a huge panoply. I mean, even people who took train rides set up committees to run the train ride, you know, because train travel was a nightmare in Russia at the time. So it was it was like what Marx said in the German ideology, that it's only in the act of revolution that people are changed and that they can get rid of all the shit of the previous society. And this was happening. And it wasn't happening by accident. Lenin repeatedly was saying, nobody else can make the revolution except you. One of his most famous quotes is, "It is important for us to draw literally all working people into the government of the state. It is a task of tremendous difficulty, but socialism cannot be implemented by a minority, by the party. It can only be implemented by tens of millions when they have learned to do it for themselves." And all that changed in April 1918. In that month, April 1918, some people think, oh yeah, March 1918 was Brest-Litovsk, or it's a civil war. But it was neither Brest-Litovsk nor the Civil War that caused Lenin to have a rethink. What caused him to have a rethink was the economic crisis that the Bolsheviks had inherited from the provisional government. This Edward Acton, in his book, Rethinking the Russian Revolution, he said it was like to the extent of a Black Death. It was so severe. And the Bolshevik Revolution actually made it slightly worse, because the Bolsheviks had come to power proclaiming peace. And what were most of the factories doing? Making war goods. So unemployment rose dramatically. And at the same time, food supplies to the town in a Russian winter, after a very bad harvest in 1917, the winter of 1918 was extremely harsh. And so what happened was that there was a massive exodus from the main cities, including St. Petersburg. And it meant that not only did many worker activists leave, but it also meant that the Bolshevik Party lost about 40% of its membership in Petrograd itself. And it was at this point that Lenin, and it took him actually something like a month to write it. He wrote a document called The Immediate Tasks of the Soviet Government. And this is if you want to see a switch that turns the revolution around, this is the switch. Because it was eventually adopted by the Executive Committee of the Soviets, and it was also adopted by the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party by the 3rd of May. And then an instruction was sent out to all Soviets that they should follow the injunctions of this new document by Lenin, The Immediate Tasks of the Soviet Government. And this was the document that stepped away from what had been going on up to that point. Lenin now says the economic crisis is chaotic. He can see that the workers are taking too long to learn for themselves. Therefore, we need to reintroduce capitalist methods. We need to employ specialists. We need to have one-man management, and we need to change how we run the economy, because we have got to boost production. Because the idea, of course, was if they had production of goods, they could exchange them for food with the peasants. It was actually not a very clever economic idea, but it's a sideshow, really, that one. But because the peasants didn't really have anything that they wanted from the industrial sites, but at least the peasants got their land from the Bolsheviks. So they were prepared at first to tolerate a certain degree of seizure of food at that point. Now, obviously, the Bolsheviks weren't homogenous, and this is the other myth that we have to hammer. And in the early months, they couldn't even agree what the role of the party was in the revolution. And when Lenin wrote The Immediate Tasks of the Soviet Government, then the left communists, the ones who wrote the magazine Communist, they then rose up in opposition to Lenin's new ideas. They'd regarded Lenin as one of them till that point, because he'd been on the left of the party. Now he was moving towards agreeing with the right, who wanted a more moderate kind of approach to how they were going to socialize production. And for the left communists, it was bad enough the signing of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which they regarded at the time wrongly as the undermining of the international revolution. But what was worse was what Lenin was proposing was something that undermined everything they understood about socialism. And they were put up a vociferous opposition for 2 to 3 months. But what brought about their silence was the beginning of the Civil War. And July 1918 was an absolute disastrous month for the future of the revolution. By this time, Trotsky had gone from his role as Commissar for Foreign Affairs to Commissar for War. And he was entrusted with the building of the Red Army. But he now made one of the many sort of blunders that you tend to get in revolutions, when he decided that the Czech Legion, which is a legion that had been formed by the Tsarist regime, who were going to go back to Czechoslovakia to fight for the independence of Czechoslovakia from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he decided that they should be disarmed. He obviously had no idea that these were crack soldiers who were well armed, and he tried to send Red Army raw recruits to disarm them. The result was that the Czechs fought back and captured 1,000 miles of the Trans-Siberian Railway, basically cutting Russia in half. And this was a great boost to the whites, who until that point had been battered into the corners of the far corners of the old Russian Empire. And now they had a chance to come back with the help of the Czechs. The Czechs at first helped them until they realized that they were even more reactionary than the people they were hoping to overthrow when they got back home. And the Czechs eventually get out of Russia to leave via Vladivostok and come back round to Czechoslovakia that way. But the damage was done. The Civil War was now started, and the Civil War is what creates a state, and it creates a state outside of the Soviets. And this is very, very critical for the future of the revolution. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the other bad bit of news in July 1918 was the 5th All-Russian Soviet Congress, because at that Congress, the left SRs were still present. They had resigned from Sovnarkom, the government, the Soviet, the Council of People's Commissars, but they hadn't left the Soviets, and they hadn't left their position in the Soviets. And they were present at the 5th Congress in July. But in the middle of it, they decided to attempt to revive the war with Germany by assassinating the German ambassador, Count Mirbach. The actual assassination was a botched, terrible business. But what happened was that some left SR regiments weren't sure what was going on, and they had a standoff for 2 days against a small group of Bolshevik soldiers in the middle of this Congress. And you could see it, obviously this was like a big break, because the one other party that was left in the Soviets was the left SRs. And with them leaving, and now they weren't completely proscribed. The Bolsheviks actually were quite clever. They only arrested the ones that they considered to have been party to the plot to kill Mirbach. They let the others go. Although Maria Spiridonova, who was the leader of the left SRs, she openly took responsibility for the plot, even though she personally, I think, Robert and I have discussed this, was quite sympathetic to the idea of signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, but the other left SR's leaders were absolutely against it. So Maria Spiridonova also gets arrested and not released until December 1918. But it's a beginning of a shift in the revolution, because the other thing that happens in August is that the SRs, both left and right, go back to their old tactic of terrorism. And sad story in August in Petersburg, the head of the Cheka in Petersburg was a man called Moisir Uritsky. And Uritsky was actually one of the ones who was determined that the Cheka would only act within the control of the Soviets and would only act in a just fashion. He's gunned down by an ex-soldier whose friend had been arrested by another Cheka unit earlier. And that was in August. Later that month, Dora Kaplan tried to assassinate Lenin and was nearly And well, she didn't assassinate him, but I think she killed him because her bullet was left in his brain. But she, those two attempted assassinations, and Lenin nearly died in the first few days of September 1918, led to the Red Terror. And the Red Terror is what really lets the Cheka loose as a separate body, separate from the Soviets. And it's the same with the Red Army. The Red Army grows mainly by recruiting peasants for the next 2 years to 5 million men. And in the course of it, it abandons all idea of being a proletarian militia, which was the original idea that it was going to be some kind of militia. So what you're getting is a constant moving away of the system towards a state, which is not a worker state, but a state which is a state above the workers. So this was the beginning of the end of the positive period of the revolution. And at the same time, although Sovnarkom wasn't an ideal government, I mean, it shouldn't have existed. They should have just had the chief, the Central Executive Committee of the Soviets should have been the government, and that should have been it. But they had this extra layer of the Sovnarkom above them. But the Sovnarkom was quite an unwieldy body because it worked on a very collegial basis, and it wasn't like a government ministry as such, because the commissar was only like a chairman of a little group. And it was found that this wasn't working very well. So what happened was, within the Bolshevik Party, they decided that also the Central Committee was also too big, and instead they would have a small group of 5, which they called the Political Bureau. And the Politburo was established in 1919. And this gradually becomes the real government of Russia. And so what you're getting on is, not only have you got a state that's not a worker state, but it's on its way to becoming a party state. And these come to fruition in 1920 at the 9th Party Congress. In the 9th Party Congress, all these reforms of the Politburo, and an organization bureau was created, and a control commission. These were attacked. Sorry, the Politburo had been established in 1919, but in at the 9th Congress, these things were discussed yet again and opposed by various oppositions, from the military and opposition and democratic centralists through to the workers' opposition and Myasnikov's workers' group. And all were calling at different times in 1919 and 1920 for the revival of worker initiative, but they all called in vain. And in fact, Myasnikov was later say that the 9th Party Congress was the real coup of the Bolshevik Party, and that was when the party took over from the Soviets in full time. The Reds, the RCPB government, win the Civil War, but by the end of 1920, the situation was economically even more desperate than it had been in 1918. After 2 years of requisitioning, the peasantry have reduced the area that they planted, and this meant that there was the danger of famine, especially in the Volga region, and the peasants revolted en masse all over the place. The Cheka said that there were 118 peasant revolts across the country. And in the towns, because famine was beckoning and there was a great shortage of bread, the bread ration was cut again. Can you imagine, in a Russian winter, told that your bread ration for one day is a slice of bread? Right, this was the bread ration in December 1918. And of course, this led to the workers to call for the Soviets to be re-elected, and to be re-elected on a free basis without interference by the party or the Cheka. And they were not listened to, so they went on strike. And there was a strike wave both in Moscow and Petersburg at this time. The party only just managed to suppress these, but with a combination of A, finding more bread, and B, using various checker mechanisms and arresting what they thought were the ringleaders, because basically they didn't see this as a spontaneous workers' revolt. They saw it as something that was organized by the Mensheviks. And the Mensheviks did get listened to at this time. They were making a revival, the Mensheviks, but every time the Mensheviks tried to mention, oh, we've got to get rid of the Soviets and go back to the Constituent Assembly, the workers stopped listening to them. So the Mensheviks were only able to articulate the economic grievances, not the political grievances of the working class. But of course, the famous episode that comes next is that the sailors from Kronstadt send a delegation to Petersburg to find out what's going on. And when they find out what's going on, this delegation reports back. And on the battleship Petropavlovsk, they pass the resolution which calls for new Soviet elections. They don't call for Soviets without communists. That's later in an article in the Kronstadt Izvestia, but that was only circulated in Kronstadt. The Petropavlovsk resolution doesn't call for that. It calls for all parties to have the right to be elected, including the Bolsheviks. And this is an attempt to revive working class democracy. It's also a recognition that the revolution's finished, because the second part of the Kronstadt program is also what's going to become new economic policy at the 10th Party Congress, which was just about to start in March 1921 at that point. So the Kronstadters are calling for Soviet democracy, and then the same thing, really, as Lenin's going to propose in a few days. Where was the prospect for compromise? There wasn't any. The Paul Avrich, the anarchist historian, is a very generous historian in some ways. He said the Bolsheviks were absolutely terrified that the ice would melt. Rumor had gone around that the ice was already melting in the streets of Kronstadt, and if the ice of the sea melted, then the Petropavlovsk and the Sevastopol, the other battleship, which were the only two battleships the Russian Navy had left by then, would be free. And that would give the Kronstadters the upper hand. And not only that, Kotlin Island, on which Kronstadt was based, could not be reached other than by having a navy. And the Bolsheviks had very little in the way of a navy. So in a sense, time forced their hand. And so the suppression of Kronstadt took place. And it cost the lives of 10,000 Bolsheviks to take the fortress across the ice. And about 2,000 of the defenders died. But I think we can say that the positive hope for the revolution died on the ice of the Gulf of Finland. And this was reinforced as well by the suppression of the revolt of Makhno. Makhno had been in alliance with the Bolsheviks throughout most of the Civil War. They'd fallen out 4 times, but they'd repatched it up. And Makhno's insurgent army had actually taken part in the last battle of the Civil War to get rid of Wrangel. But as soon as that was over, Makhno was accused of insubordination by Frunze, the commander of the Soviet forces in the south, and they then started hounding him out of Ukraine. It took them several months. And of course, what helped the Bolsheviks was the new economic policy, which was decided at the 10th Party Congress, because this now said, we're going to stop requisitioning grain and the peasants can keep it. And instead, we're going to make them pay a small tax, and that's in kind, payment of about 1/10 of their produce, which of course is what they would have paid to the old Orthodox Church. And this would then be the way for peasants to then go forward. And this, I think, undermined Makhno, because in the end, he was actually attacked by some peasants before he left Russia, and left at the end of, I think in August 1921, and never returned there again. And of course, 1921 wasn't just the end of the hopes for the revolution at home, it was also the end of it abroad, because in that month, the March action led to the stupid attempt at a putsch, really, in Germany, which further destroyed a promising communist movement that was building up in Germany. And Radek and Zinoviev were behind the plot, and it was really badly constructed, and especially as half the German party were in favour of waiting a lot longer, and half were just ready to fire off at any old time. So the result was that the German party further undermined its own capacities, and it was basically the last gasp of the world revolution at that point. I know there's people will say, oh, there was this or that, but these were well after the event, and they were far too late to save the Russian Revolution. In fact, the opposite happened. From 1921 onwards, the Russian Communist Party, which has set up the new international in 1919, the Third International, they dominate it so much that the international has to adopt the priorities of the Russian party. So when the Russian party says in 1921, in the middle of 1921, we have to go to the masses, what they're saying to the communists who've just escaped from social democracy to form these new communist parties in Italy, Germany, and elsewhere, is go back to the same social democrats. And this is confirmed the following year in 1922, when they set up the United Front, which means that they are forced to go back to trying to make some alliance with these people. This then leads to basically all these parties are Bolshevized, which means that they are taken over or run by people who are loyal to Moscow. And it's the end really of the international revolution movement. And I think one of the things that makes the defeat all the harder is that we have a situation where in the space of less than 10 years, the working class has been betrayed by two internationals. And this adds really to the bitterness of the pill that we have to swallow with the defeat of the revolution inside an isolated Russia. And of course, the final issue that I want to deal with is the banning of factions in the Communist Party itself at the 10th Party Congress. Whilst Lenin's alive, this is not really acted upon. The factions continue to exist, but it's a wonderful weapon in the hands of the new Commissar of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate, which is also a commissariat that includes the Control Commission about how party members may behave, and it's led by a man called Joseph Stalin. And so Stalin here is now already getting a power base. And in 1922, when he's given the new job of General Secretary, he's also got the ability to appoint local party secretaries who then organize the elections to the congresses of the party. The left of the party can see what's happening, and now their shift, the shift of their view has gone from trying to fight for democracy in the Soviets or Soviet democracy in the country to fighting for democracy in the party. And it's this last gasp of some of the people who like the Dekists, like Sapranov, Smirnov, Osinski, they now give up. They now join with the Trotsky left opposition in trying, in their different ways, to get party democracy restored. But by this time, the horse has already bolted. In fact, what we can see throughout the Russian Revolution is once you stop the initiative of the masses in making the revolution, you can't uncork the bottle and unleash them again. Class consciousness doesn't work like that. It works as it works, and it has to be allowed to operate. And this is one of the reasons why we have to draw some lessons from the experience. And I know some people will think, they laugh at the idea of taking lessons from history, but I can't understand that kind of objection, because what else is our learning experience defined by, except from learning from past experience? And obviously, basically, there's three lessons. The first, obviously, is that the revolution has to be international, which means it will have to occur in a context of a global crisis, which mobilizes workers everywhere. And even if they don't have revolutions everywhere, at least it would make for the formation of a class movement that paralyzes governments and stops them intervening in any place where the working class does manage to carry out a revolution. And the second thing is the relationship between the party and the class. Now, the councilists drew the lesson from the Russian Revolution that all parties were bourgeois, as Otto Ruler wrote. But this is, apart from being an ahistorical statement, because parties are defined differently in different epochs and different parties, the proletariat has a need for some form of political cohesion. Why? Because it doesn't have a form of property to defend. So it has to have a program and a cohesion uniting around something that is both political and international. And this is why it has to have some kind of political body that acts as its guide and leadership in the run-up to the revolution. But this is where the rub comes. It's the party is the tool for leading the revolution, but it's not the tool for completing the revolution. And this is where we come back to the initiative of the class. The party's got to be part of the smashing of the bourgeois state, but its role then is the same. And there were, and Robert might remind me of this later, there were in the Bolshevik Party in 1918 people who said the party shouldn't be in the Soviets. The party shouldn't be in any form of government. Our role is to carry on agitating for communism outside of these things. Leave the workers to do what they have to do. Because in the situation that any working class isolated group finds itself, it will have to make decisions which are unpalatable. But if the decisions are made by the Soviets and not by one political party, then it's their decision. They own it, they can change it. And it doesn't put into question the whole communist project. The whole communist project remains with the party. The party then is working internationally to spread the revolution and at the same time to fight within any proletarian bastion for a communist program, for the abolition of the law of value. Might not be possible, but the party will never give up fighting for it. And that's why its members might be in the Soviet, but the party as a body doesn't take part in the governmental apparatus, even if some parts of the government delegations are party members. It's tricky, but I think this is the recognition that in the working class toolbox, the party has one role and the Soviets have another. And I think that's the one thing that the Russian Revolution has given us. And in fact, I would say that the great undying contribution of the Russian workers from the first 2 decades of the last century are that they gave us a mechanism for understanding how we can go from having a body that has to suppress the alien class of capitalists, but at the same time doesn't erect a state. Workers' councils and Soviets, they reconcile the maximum of real direct democracy with the creation of a structure which can carry out the task of first suppressing capitalist class. And then as the classless society is established, their statist functions are over and they can be transformed into a global network for coordinating the world economy in such a way that it both can solve the problems of ecology, allow for sustainability of production, and ensure that no one suffers want or starvation. And I think that's what the Russian Revolution leaves us with. That's it, folks.
It's tragic, isn't it? Last time we were discussing the Italian left and the formation of the Italian Communist Party, which was just before Kronstadt. And you realise how key timing is and the need for an international party before any local outbreak occurs. I mean, I think it just so kind of hits you in the face that already by the time of the formation of the Italian party, the Russian Revolution had almost had it, and the German Revolution had already had, a kick in the teeth after Spartacus. So the lesson that the party has to be, it's more than just like it has to be an agglomeration of different, individual national parties. You know, it has to be somehow or other organised in a really international way, international and internationalist way before the revolution. And you know, how can we? Well, we're doing our best, but how can you do that? You know, until the actual situation pushes the working class to even think in these terms. When the Russian Revolution broke out, Bordigo had just been called up at the time of Caporetto, you know, when 10,000 Italian soldiers were killed, and you know, the most devastating battle for them in the First World War. You know, it's what a big contrast between the situations.
All the time that I'm talking, I'm very conscious that we know what they didn't know, you know, and you know, it's the only tribute we can pay to them is to learn from their experience, because their experience informs us about what went wrong. I mean, I've just realized that I left out state capitalism, you know, that Russia ended up as a new form of state capitalism. I mean, nobody produced a better analysis of state capitalism than Bukharin before 1916, but he didn't even realize that in his head, he didn't see that the Russian Communist Party would become the state capitalist party of Russia. And in fact, they created a new model of state capitalism based on the mobilization of workers to the tune of a state that was actually exploiting them. And of course, you know, like Cuba, China, Vietnam, Korea, they all, you know, when you see all these big displays and things, they're all copying the example of the Soviet Union from the 1920s and 30s. And this they didn't realize. But the other question, you know, like, we also know the critical nature of having an international movement. They did, but the fact that it'd been betrayed in 1914, I mean, the absolute betrayal of the Second International really does hit hard, and it hits harder the longer the revolution goes on. You know, it's paradoxical, isn't it? The betrayal is in 1914, but the fact that the Social Democrats have then made peace with capitalism and are then going to act as its agents and save capitalism, you know, is really what hits home in 1918 and 1919. And we know that we need an international, and it needs to be in place before the revolution. You can't have it established after the revolution. So there needs to be some kind of international network. Possibly it's easier to do that. I mean, we've got our little international here today of 12 people, you know, spread over 4 or 5 countries, and this is you know, we have the means, the technology to create an international much more easily than they had. I mean, they had to get on a boat and go seasick through the Baltic to get to Russia to have an international meeting, as Sylvia Pankhurst did. So possibly, you know, possibly that's what you have to do. But the lesson of it is that we need a party that isn't geographically located. It's an international party for the whole working class.
Mm. Mm. It's also interesting about, you know, like the argument, that sort of pseudo-Marxist argument that the Russian Revolution couldn't have been proletarian because Russia wasn't developed as a capitalist state enough. It hadn't got a properly developed capitalist economy, which is what Gramsci started off by saying. You know, he said this is, after the February Revolution, he said this is the revolution against capital, meaning that it proves that you can have a workers' revolution without a capitalist economy. And it's it's almost like splitting hairs now about what kind of economy Russia was, but it was certainly taking part in a war that was part of an international imperialist capitalist war, and you know, the whole basis of the people who were making the revolution was wage labor. You know, as is obviously apparent when we're talking about, you know, cuts to bread rations, which is because their wages weren't high enough and so on. And it basically, you've got a working class there making a revolution, albeit in a, you know, in a very much within the context of a peasant surrounding countryside.
Well, that's the key thing, because the Russian working class was actually one of the largest in the world. And it got larger during the First World War. It was also a class that was exploited by both the state, because there's a lot of state capitalism under the Tsars. You know, a lot of factories were actually owned by the state, and by international capitalism. If you look at the names of the factories in Petersburg, you know, Ericsson, Singer, there was a Belgian firm I can't remember the name of. They were all international multinationals who were in Russia. So in terms of actual capitalist nature, the capitalist parts of Russia were like everywhere else. And in fact, some of the research I did, some researchers said that the actual living conditions in some parts of Petersburg were better than they were in Turin in Italy. You know, so you know, the idea that Russia's just this completely backward country doesn't quite fit the facts. And it's also, I mean, Lenin in 1899 proved that it was a capitalist country in the development of capitalism in Russia, and also the work that Bukharin did showed that Russia was fundamentally capitalist. The big problem, of course, was that it relied fundamentally on a peasant agriculture to feed it, because one of the things that happened in the course of 1917 was the big landed estates, which actually were where Russia exported its grain to Western Europe, they were broken up by the peasants, and they were the most efficient forms of agriculture, whereas the general peasant agriculture was incredibly, well, it was one jump above subsistence. So it wasn't something that was going to be easy to feed people. And of course, the requisitioning policy, which was good for an emergency in the spring of 1918, but a disaster throughout the Civil War, was only added to the problems that they faced.
What I think is quite interesting, if you don't mind me jumping in, Jock, is that a lot of the people who say that Lenin was a blankist will also say that he or Russia wasn't ready for a revolution economically because it was a peasant society. But that argument that Russia wasn't ready for a revolution and it was a peasant society was made by the populist Blankists against Lenin at the time, or at the beginning of Lenin's career. I think the first few chapters of Neil Harding's book on Lenin's political thought are really good on that. I've been reading that a bit recently, and he discusses how even from the very early 1890s, there's an awareness in the Russian socialist movement that capitalism is going to emerge in Russia, and it will be the working class that lead the February Revolution, or what became the February Revolution, the Democratic Revolution. It has to be working class that are at the head of that. I thought what you were saying there at the start about the February Revolution being led by the workers it stands out as being quite a controversial thing to say, because, as you say, a lot of the literature on this period has it as being led by the intellectuals, the middle class, and it's the sort of model for, you know, the bourgeois revolution. But actually, even as I said, as early as 1890, the guys like Plekhanov and Axelrod were fully aware that if there was going to be even a democratic revolution in Russia, it had to be led by the workers. In the same tune as 1848 had been led by the workers as well, and it had been usurped by the sort of counter-revolution.
Good point. Yeah, the main book that everybody says is wonderful on the February Revolution is by an American-Japanese guy called Hasegawa, and he argues if it hadn't been for the Mensheviks, the workers would have been massacred. But the Mensheviks only set up the Soviet when the workers had already fought for it and died for it, and it doesn't match. There's a better book to use. The best book, it was written actually in Soviet Russia in the 1950s, I think, by a man called Burjalov, and it's called Russia's Second Revolution, and it is absolutely splendid as a source. Trotsky actually uses all the same sources in his The Russian Revolution, and Trotsky's The Russian Revolution is a wonderful piece of literature, which is actually quite solidly based, but he only stops at the end of 1917, so he stops at the October Revolution, so it's not much use thereafter. But the sources they use are mainly a guy called Kayurov, who was a worker activist in Petersburg, and but Burjalov is a really readable book. It's a bit too, the Bolsheviks did everything, but which they didn't. For example, the Metra were equally as important, even though they had only a few hundred people compared to the Bolsheviks' few thousand. But they're the first ones to issue a leaflet on International Women's Day to actually get the movement going. So whoever, it's the workers who do the fighting and dying, and it's only when they're about to get their own Soviets that the Mensheviks produce a rabbit out of the hat to get this institutional Soviet going.
It always seemed quite artificialist, like a few months after the bourgeois democratic revolution. There's then this Protarian Revolution, which tends to be depicted, not in what's his name, but they tend to depict it as, this is the Bolshevik coup, and Kamenev and Zinoviev, were like basically announced it was going to happen, and that was, that's somehow dodgy as compared to February, where it was all spontaneous, and this. Whereas and that was a bourgeois revolution, whereas the Protarian, it wasn't really a Protarian revolution, it was a party coup, that hijacked the whole thing. And that kind of narrative, it's never made sense, but I think to sort of openly say that February was, basically the beginning of the Proletarian Revolution and not a bourgeois revolution with a bourgeois agenda.
Yeah, in fact, it explains why the October Revolution is so quiet.
Yeah.
It's taking off the job that was already started. That despite all the attempts to divert the workers, despite the July days, despite the Kornilov uprising, the workers remain, and in fact they remain even after the counter-revolution starts, the workers remain absolutely loyal to Soviet power. Even when the Soviets have no power, they still are loyal to Soviets. And that's it goes right through. Even when the Soviets are useless, there's still a remnant of workers in them saying, these are ours. And of course Stalin, plays on that, make it, but I think that's what, 1917, it's one continuum. There's it's a government that emerges in crisis, and dual power, they all say, was a bit of a fake. Well, because it was a fake, the fake was on the provisional government side. The real government was the Soviet from the beginning, if only the Soviets were controlled by the working class, and that doesn't come until September, until after the Kornilov affair.
This idea that you need to have a bourgeois revolution and a proletarian, already largely discredited in Marx when he recognises that Britain is a bourgeois country without having reversed the Restoration. It is the country which has a king, but it is a bourgeois country.
I'm sorry I get that.
Well, doesn't Marx remark that Britain has a bourgeois monarchy and a bourgeois aristocracy, pointing out that Britain is a bourgeois country despite having an aristocracy and a monarchy.
All right.
That the actual revolution is not necessary for the bourgeoisie to take over. The Restoration reversed the only revolution we had, And apart from the anti-Catholic one, great glorious one, supposedly, that we ever had. And yet Britain is not only a bourgeois country, but the foremost bourgeois country for a long time.
Yeah.
It's just
connection with the
formalism, isn't it?
the argument of the February Revolution. I mean, I know it's got the broad connection, but
well, I mean, the bourgeoisie doesn't need its own democratic revolution to take over.
no.
So if it's taken over, you don't have a democratic revolution against the bourgeoisie.
You don't have to.
No.
You don't have to have a bourgeois class. Well, you do.
You have a dominant bourgeois class. Okay, it wasn't so dominant in Russia as it was in Britain, but once you've got that, there's no need for a bourgeois revolution. It's happened by the back door.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah, in fact, the legislation came after the bourgeoisie had already got power.
It does beg the question, doesn't it, of the role of the party, though? If the party's international and you still need to have, I mean, obviously you have to have an organisation that has roots, political people in individual states who are connected to, part of the working class who basically are just involved in what's going on. So, you can't just say, oh, well, the party has to be, up above it all and somewhere, not in this or that country. It has to be in every country, really, but and a natural part of what it is. It can't be just sort of like parachuted in, and as a the political guide and so on. Very.
No, the party is part of the class.
Yes.
So
the party of the future is not. It's not going to resemble, I don't know, some sort of even the Third International at the very beginning, or it has to be more rooted as well as more global. It has to be sort of coming together.
What I think is obviously the party will, before a revolution, the party will create its own organs. It'll have its executive committee or whatever. And what I would say is that the people who run the party do not have anything to do with the state. Party members are different. Party members are ordinary workers, and as ordinary workers, they'll get delegated. And their delegation will be like a barometer of where class consciousness is lying. And sometimes it'll go down, and sometimes it'll go up, right? But all the time, the individual party members, as party members and delegated workers, will fight in the class-wide organs for the communist program. Some of them will be occasionally thrown out, but they'll carry on fighting wherever they're from, and they might get back in again until such a time as the situation is where the working class has got control over enough of the world to be able to make a big transformation in the mode of production. But the party executive or whatever becomes an international executive, which his sole job is to promote the world revolution on an international scale. And it doesn't, I mean, Lenin had no actual official role in the Communist Party, but he was chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. So he had a role in the state, but he had no role in the party. In fact, what I'm saying is he should have had a role in the party and nothing in the state. And this is the key thing, because if workers themselves are going to make the revolution, they can do it in the Soviets. And this is, I think this is what Honorato Damen in that famous 1952 platform said. The class does not delegate to anybody, not even to its class party, the task of ruling the society. And this, I think, was one of his more, I don't know what Honorato Damen knew about the Russian Revolution, but it's certainly one of his more prescient kind of observations. And of course, it's what led to the split with the Bordigas, or helped to lead to the split with the Bordigas. A completely different conception. And Bordigas' conception is absolutely the same as Stalin's is in the foundations of Leninism. But he says exactly the same. The party rules. And the party is the vanguard.
I just had a question. I'm just wondering, because I know that a lot of the kind of the other sort of, I guess, the Marxist, Leninist and Trotskyist parties claim that like they are the nucleus of the party to come, and that like when the revolution comes, they will lead it. And I know that the CWO and the ICT don't make any claim to be like the pole of organisation, but how do you think that the party will arise? Will it arise? Because obviously the Bolsheviks existed as an organisation prior to the Russian Revolution, but will the party arise as the revolution's unfolding, or will it have to emerge beforehand?
I think the key thing that you've fingered there is that there has to be a skeleton of a party on an international level everywhere. The Bolsheviks were only a skeleton in 1918, mainly because they'd been smashed. But they were a hell of a skeleton. You know, like the Okhrana would arrest the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks, the ones who were in Russia. Most of them, of course, weren't there. But they'd get sent off to Siberia. So what would happen then would be that the Petersburg Committee of the Bolshevik Party would take over the role of the Central Committee. And then when the Petersburg Committee was arrested, the Vyborg Committee, which is the most working class area just to the north of Petersburg, they took over the role of the Central Committee as well. So that you had a party of able workers who knew what to do and were able, and in fact, Shlyapnikov in his memoir says the party improved during the First World War because we were deserted by all the intellectuals. We were only a workers' party. And in fact, Shlyapnikov was a worker himself. He wasn't a big shakes intellectual. He was the main man left in Petrograd, or in Petersburg in 1917. He didn't do very well at the beginning. You know, he made a lot of mistakes. But again, you know, these were corrected by the other workers. And but it was a party that had a living existence. And I see that if we can establish an international network of people who are not just, I mean, at the moment, we're hardly in connection with each other, never mind the class, you know, with people who have some connection with the workers all the time, then we, and not just people who are, you know, academics or whatever, then we can build an organization that could be the basis for a future international. And obviously, I'm not just talking about the CWO or the ICT. I'm talking about with other people, and there are other people around the world who are asking the same questions as us, who are not, you know, like the Trotskyists. I mean, the problem with the Trotskyists is A, they still think state capitalism is socialism for the most part, and B, they still believe that the party is the one that rules. And this, well, I think what we've learned is that these are recipes for disaster, and that and the thing is, there's no halfway house here. Either we have the Soviet system, which is the most democratic system that has ever been devised in human history, or you have another system of people directing other people, and that's the choice that the revolution's thrown up. And to my mind, that's the choice we keep putting to people and saying we've got to go for the one that produces the initiative of the people who are going to make the new world, because it's not going to be us, you know. I mean, that's one. Lenin sometimes recognised that. He recognised it at the end, but he didn't really understand what he was saying. He said, you know, one of his last speeches, he says, because it's very naive to think that communists can make communism. Communists alone can't make communism. But he doesn't go back to what he said in 1918. He then says, we need some help from the bourgeoisie, which is a very sad sort of end for him.
Just begs the question, doesn't it, of whether Soviets will appear or the equivalent councils, whatever we call them, some mass assemblies in the next revolutionary situation. And I'm not saying because of the structure of work or anything like that, although that probably is an issue, like in smaller workplaces and fragmented workforces, because I think the Soviets were more than just workplace things, if I understand it rightly. They're quite low,
Yeah.
and so on. But and although a map of where Soviets appeared all through the time of the revolutionary period throughout the world, it seems that the sort of core Soviet idea is that sprang from the Russian situation, and I wonder. I mean, we don't know. So it's a bit of a daft question in a way, but should the party be actually beforehand, pointing to how such organisations can be created?
I think that's what we do whenever we go to strikes or whatever. We point to the things which workers used to do to self-organize themselves, and we bring that back to them. I mean, the Russian workers didn't need anybody to tell them what to do, right? Because after 1905, they already had a plan. They already had a model. And that's why in 1917, they could say spontaneously on the streets, we need Soviets. But we're in a different epoch and a different time. We live in a situation where that lesson has almost been lost, and it's our role to keep hammering away at it. And let's face it, what's capitalism doing now? It's on the brink of destroying humanity, right? In terms of, the whole historical life of humanity. It's nearer to the end than it's ever been with this system, whether it's ecological, violent, or famine. They're all stalking the world, and this pandemic is going to make it worse. It's the reason we're still small is because the class hasn't yet moved in sufficient numbers in any one place for us to have something to latch onto. Once we have an example like 1905 that we can concretely take to other workers around the world, we will be on a completely different ideological plane. We're already slightly better off than we've been. I mean, those of us who've been revolutionaries for rather longer than we'd care to remember have been hammering away at anti-capitalism for years and years and years. In 2008, until 2008, we were laughed at. Oh, it's a capitalist plot, is it? Every time we tried to say anything. But after 2008, nobody stopped. Nobody was laughing at us for calling anything capitalist. Since then, anti-capitalism is everywhere. The problem is, a lot of the people who think they're anti-capitalists are only anti one aspect of capitalism or one type of capitalism. They aren't anti the whole wretched system. And that's obviously another of the tasks that revolutionaries have to perform in getting across the message that our experience as a class tells us differently, and that this experience of Russia, although it looks negative, it looks to have only negative lessons on the superficial glance, in a more deep sense, has a more profound assistance to us, because it gave us that form that opens the key to how we can transform society. And it's not the party, it's the Soviet.
I think, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, fine.
Yeah. Just one thing about the analysis of just the overall analysis of saying the Russian Revolution failed because it was isolated. I think that sort of statement needs to be clearer about what we mean by isolation, because a lot of people would sort of interpret that and sort of say, oh, well, Russia's massive, how much of the world do you need? But it's not really about size, it's about trade. A lot of these, in capitalism, it's not just that you have local production and then trade is sort of an add-on to that gives, that sort of fills in the gaps or whatever. trade replaces local production. So what you need and what you want is dependent on trade in order within capitalism. And so when a revolution breaks out, all these things that you sort of rely on as just sort of vanish. And so this is why, like, say, embargoes can be effective counter-revolutionary strategies, not just like military tactics. But yeah, so this is why internationalism is also an absolute necessity today, where we have this global global market economy, where it's all just, we're all dependent on each other. In that sort of vein, when, you know, a lot of like Lenin was also like, talked about the German Revolution a lot as that's sort of a necessity for that to succeed. But it's also that it's not just Germany. Like, Germany wouldn't have been enough at that time. It would need to like spread to the rest of Europe as well, and also maybe to America at that time. Because just spreading to Germany wouldn't just solve all their problems because they're like a rich country or whatever. They're also very dependent on trade and stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know, what do people think?
And we're starving.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, in a way, you said at the beginning, Russia was a big country, and as a big country, it has colossal resources, most of them at the time undeveloped, but it did have the ability to feed itself. And that's where one of the things I think a point I didn't make that you've reminded me of is that the Bolsheviks did requisition to begin with, but requisitioning was like taking it off them. Whereas what they eventually adopted in 1921 was free trade. Free trade existed illegally throughout the Civil War. And there was a huge market in Moscow, the Sudoveka, was it Sudoveska? I've forgotten its name. But they would occasionally shut it down and arrest people, the Cheka. But it would reopen again because people had to trade. And so trade is, you're quite right, is a really significant issue. And of course, we're seeing it around the world, you know, like embargoes on countries is now a political weapon, even between bourgeois countries, never mind what they would do to any other countries. And what workers can do if workers are sympathetic with a country where a revolution has broken out, all they can do is act negatively. You know, like I'm thinking in 1920, when the London dockers refused to load the Jolly George supply ship, sending munitions to the British troops that had invaded Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. These actions could only stop something happening. It couldn't actually get a supply route moving. I must admit, supply chains in the modern world I have to give me sleepless nights. You know, how are we going to keep them going? You know, in the situation of where there won't be the previous arrangements, deals, contracts. It will not be a small problem. The working class will have to come up with some very inventive solutions, I think, if it's going to exist. But I think your overall point about isolation is a good one. And it's quite true about Germany, even if they had got to Germany. But Lenin always said, though, Germany was only like the next step. It was like, you know, the launching point for the next version. And of course, by this time, the United States was the place where you wanted a revolution. And at the time, it was the least likely, being the least war damaged for it to happen, even though there was a massive set of struggles in the 1920s, in the very early 1920s, and what was called the Red Scare in America. It certainly it wasn't significant enough to, in any way, shape or form, threaten the system there. But it's isolation's a concrete thing, and I think that's the gist of what you're saying. I think you're right.
Yeah, I think we need, like you said, like we need like an example like 1905 to present that the class can understand. That's sort of like an example of what supply chains would look like in communism. Yeah, I think it would like involve a sort of multi-pronged approach rather than just a one-size-fits-all sort of replacement. Yeah.
Thing is, we've got probably not for young people, but for us, like the collapse of the Soviet Union. I remember the Italians said, "Oh, it's terrible," not because they thought the Soviet Union had anything to do with communism, but because this was the last sort of breath, or the last kind of a bit of an example of what the working class had achieved, you know. And we argued, no, it's a good thing. It's good it's collapsed. So all that nonsense that the USSR was communist, you know, is blown out the window. But the fact is that that's the last example of what happened to, at the end of the day, the Russian Revolution ended up in this nightmare Stalinist, claustrophobic to society that eventually couldn't maintain its position in the world, and they didn't even, or what have we got left? Complete sort of division and a lack of any political compass whatsoever. And I don't know how much the situation of the working class is down to that, basically an ideological thing, as opposed to what's happened to it economically, with the working class in the previously industrialized countries being basically the industry being smashed and most production sent to Far East and so on. But it's probably a combination of things that the working class does need to have an example of something like 1905, which can point the way for a wider, more a genuine revolution.
I wasn't actually putting my hand up. I was just trying to think of something to say. But I think collapse of the Soviet Union, by that time was a so-called Soviet Union, has to be a good thing, because even if people are inspired by it, if that's their model, where are they going to go when they go beyond economic struggle? They're not going to go anywhere good, are they?
Mm.
You're muted.
I know the cat muted me, sorry. It's still an ideological problem of what is known as communism. And I mean, we kind of hope that with the fall of the Eastern Bloc that it would kind of clear that away, really. But obviously they still bring up China. I mean, not even the Chinese pretend that China's communist in China. However, ideologically, it's another kind of it's always brought up as an example of what's the point of fighting? Are you fighting for this? So it's that it is a constant. It's just a constant reminder to workers that this is what happens. This is the. I mean, the ironic thing is that they won't acknowledge the Russian Revolution was a revolution, but in China they call it a revolution. Whenever it's mentioned, it was the Chinese Revolution. We would argue it wasn't. But so there's that constant ideological battle that's always going on, really. And what struck me in the talk was that the revolution. I mean, obviously it's two things. It's anti-capitalist, but it's also for something. And it's the most dynamic force, a real progressive thing in the hands of the working class, of gay rights and all the rest of it. but none of that is really mentioned in the, you know, in the day-to-day discussions of what the revolution actually is, what it consists of, and what it's striving for. You know, aside workers' power and you know, and getting rid of exploitation and classes. So I think, you know, I mean, you know, we do say this a lot, but it's always worth reminding ourselves that that's what's at stake, really.
It's about smashing the rich, or, you know.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And it's certainly not making capitalism nicer. So, you know.
I take all those points. I remember when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 or whenever it was. We thought that would be the beginning of a new era for us, and we produced our pamphlet denouncing the Trotskyists, and thought that now we printed 1,000 of them, and thought that this was going to overturn the world, but it didn't happen. But what I've noticed is in the last, if you look at the membership down the CWO, the majority are under 30. It's 30 years since then, you know, and I'm taking some kind of encouragement from the fact that we have a new generation that isn't so hidebound in that culture as I've spent all afternoon trying to annoy you with. The Soviet Union was a big cul-de-sac that we had to escape from. But I think people are looking at the world in a totally different way now, and that could be the most optimistic factor to come out of all this. And certainly the last couple of years we've been sustained by all the young people who've come to us.
Tom.
Just congratulating the young people present.
Yes. Yeah, we had the joke last time about the range of ages between this group, between me and you. If it's any consolation to you, Tom, there's somebody the same age as you in Battaglia.
Same age as
you in Battaglia.
Oh,
yeah.
Old rocks, I think.
Yeah. So we have quality. We have quality of all ages.
Thank you.
I think we've reached an artistic conclusion, don't you? Has anybody got any other questions, points, or?
When's the book coming out, John?
Well, after this afternoon, I've decided to rewrite large chunks of it. And hopefully we aren't too far away. I'm now on chapter 16. I said I would only write 15, but I'm on 16, which is conclusions. But I've had discussions with about various. Actually, I wanted to ask you about Brest-Litovsk because you've got a different take on it than me. But
well, sorry, John. I think my take comes from. I was reading Emma Goldman's book on her recollections of her time in Russia, and she mentions Maria Spiridonova, and I know we've chatted about this. Maria Spiridonova, I think, is generally thought to have voted for the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, but some years later, when she's in conversation with Emma Goldman, she mentions it as perhaps the first link in the chain of what we've discussed as being the sort of degeneration of the ideals of the October Revolution. Which I think is maybe not correct, but it's interesting anyway, just as an interesting point, because what we're talking about here was clearly also spoken about somewhat at the time, if not a few years after. So I think we can say, and we can reserve what we're saying, that well, we're very lucky to have hindsight, but also at the time there were some actors whose analysis isn't all that far off what we're saying as well.
Yeah. I mean, there are quite a few left communists who think Brest-Litovsk was the beginning of the end. I've never shared that one, but I've always had, in the book, I've written that basically the left communists were wrong to make an issue of that. And in fact, it detracted from the rest of their ideas. but the but the point I made obviously was a standard one. The German Revolution broke out within 6 months, so therefore it didn't hold up the International Revolution. But you said in your dissertation, I was quite struck by the fact that the left communists were arguing that the new Soviets would be able to fight tooth and nail against the Germans as they came in. So in other words, what you were saying, and I got this from your dissertation, was that the left communists had a coherent vision that the grassroots movement of the working class in the factories would also be reflected in the grassroots movement of the fight against the Germans when they invaded. I still don't buy it, but it's an interesting idea, because Makhno, of course, in Ukraine did the same, and he did fight a guerrilla war. On the other hand, Makhno was on the east side of the River Don, and the Germans couldn't reach there so easily. And he was like in a sort of space between all the armies, and that gave him some kind of freedom of movement. And even then, the Germans captured his hometown of Hulaya Polye. So it's, you know, it's one of these things that I can see your point of view, and I can understand, and I like the argument that you make that there's a coherence to the left communist position, but I still think that Brest-Litovsk didn't materially affect anything, especially as the Germans did. It didn't affect the German war machine. The Germans had to use 1 million soldiers to try and get the grain out of the Ukraine, which is what they already had in the Ukraine. So, you know, like, it didn't allow Ludendorff to reinforce his troops in the West to begin Operation Michael, which was that great last push that the Germans had in the summer of 1918. And in fact, that push was enabled because the Russia had collapsed, and they'd already transferred something like 500,000 troops from the east to the west to carry that out. So it's a hell of a complicated business, but I think it's worth mentioning. It's a thought-provoking idea that there was a coherence in the left communist idea on Brest-Litovsk.
Yes, I would like to say that I agree with the presentation. I think it was very good. And I also agree with the preparatory text, also very good. Just have a few comments and one question. First, I would like to say to the critique saying that the October Revolution was a coup, I would like to refer to the mass meeting Trotsky and the Bolsheviks were assembling just before October, where thousands of workers came together. And when Trotsky made them swear the oath to do the necessary thing when the moment comes, was not very clear, but there was several of these meetings with thousands of workers. And I think in this they got the public mandate, in fact, for the October Revolution.
Oh yeah,
so, yeah. To state that. And then I think it's in the text, they take up the problem of identifying party and state, and also in the presentation you took this up, and it's a real problem, I think. But also, I think the argument you give, the international character of the party should be the sort of counter force to this problem. It's also correct, I think. But I still think it could be a problem. Yeah, this is a danger. In a revolution, there are it's not so easy. Everything happens fast, and it's a difficult situation. So it might be something we have to hammer home, and a lesson we have to try to keep alive, I think.
Yeah.
And then I have a question in the text, some formulations. Understand my English probably. There might be occasions where the party members clash again in revolutionary situations. I hope you're not saying we should shoot at the workers, or what no. Is this clash of party members?
No, that's just.
I don't understand it. Now you can explain. And then I have a fourth point.
All right.
Can I make the fourth point first, or?
Yeah, make it first. I'm writing them down.
Okay. This is what I call the dilemma. It's a dilemma, I think, Protarian bastion. Everywhere in the world where the proletariat take power, they're exposed to this dilemma. This is exemplified on the one hand with Brest-Litovsk, Rapallo, and on the other hand with mass action in 23. That means, on the one hand, the need to secure the Soviet state, could be trade, avoid famine or lack of semiconductors in our time, or just avoid invasions. On the other hand, the absolute need, which was everybody knew in Russia, for the international character of the revolution. The revolution had to spread or we are lost, which led to desperate actions like the march action and so on. But this is a real world dilemma, I think, it's not just black and white. I think Brest-Litovsk was a necessity probably. Rapallo maybe not, but this is real world dilemmas. Every local taking of power will be exposed to. And I think it's a bit within this dilemma, we have to look at Kronstadt.
Yeah.
What is the real lesson of Kronstadt? Was it just a sad, isolated example, or is it the policy for the future? I hope you're sitting down now, because you're not going to like this. I think the Kronstadt is the policy for the future. We as communists have to be prepared to prepare the workers for that it could be a situation where they have to be able to maybe demonstrate or strike against the local territorial Soviets. Because there will be the territorial Soviets that will negotiate the Rapallos and the Brest-Litovsk. Because there is no certain thing for me as a proletarian state. That is the contradiction. These state organs will be conservative nature. They will have to try to keep up status quo and protect the Soviet state to the extent even to Rapallo. This is for me the lesson of the Kronstadt.
So you're saying a proletarian state will have to kill workers?
No, absolutely not. I think we have to be prepared for the workers to push the Soviet in front of us, because they will have a tendency to conservatism. So their object will be to try to safeguard the Soviet power in this area, which will be, for example, Rapallo. And the workers have to push them in front of themselves, not shoot them necessarily. But it could be they have to demonstrate and demand re-election of the Soviets or something like NAP or whatever it will be. And
I'm assuming that
my point is that there could be a break, yeah. And revolution can only be successful if the proletariat more or less constantly is mobilized, pushing the revolution forward.
I agree with that.
And that is the lesson. Huh? That is how I understand this discussion of state or not proletarian state.
I think
that's my interpretation.
Proletarian state is an oxymoron.
Sorry?
Proletarian state is an oxymoron.
Contradiction.
It's an oxymoron. It's two words that can't go together. The dictatorship of the proletariat is never an established state. That is the difference. Lenin knew this when he wrote State and Revolution, and he couldn't solve the problem, so he called it a semi-state. And in actual fact, the dictatorship of the proletariat is not a state, and that's because of the Soviets. The Soviets are the historically discovered form of how we get from a statist situation to a situation of administration of things. And it's what Marx talks about, but he didn't know how it would happen. I think the Russian workers gave us the answer. It might be that another set of workers give it an even better answer, but if they do, I haven't got the imagination to see it. Right? I think also as well, what we know now is that the principle that we can never let go of is the principle of delegation. The Bolsheviks actually improved the delegatory principle in 1918 and then ignored it in 1919. And by doing so, they emasculated the Soviets, and they created a situation where the class and the Soviets were against each other. Or certainly the party and the Soviets were against each other, and they thought they were the class. So what we need is a situation where the Soviets actually function as they're supposed to function. And if they do, the mechanism for discussion, and I also think in the book, I actually use the phrase proletarian pluralism, because one of the problems that happens is that the Bolsheviks too quickly become the only party left. And if there's only one party, there's only one solution. It's the party solution. There has to be a kind of different approaches of different people in the Soviet, and that's what will enrich it and keep it dynamic and developing the revolution in the right direction. I mean, it's not a guarantee. And you're right that, I mean, you mentioned Rapallo and all these other things. While you were saying it, I was thinking of even more horrendous things, right? That occurred. I haven't even mentioned, you know, I mean, Rapallo was like appalling, you know, the deal with the German state, so that on the very day in which the November the 23rd revolution takes place, the Bolsheviks are training the German soldiers and they're supporting the revolution in Germany at the same time. You know, it's just an illustration of the utter mess that had arrived by 1923, way beyond the scope of the revolution, really.
It was the same in Italy during the Matteotti crisis. After Matteotti had been murdered, he was a socialist deputy, and it created a crisis for the Mussolini's regime. And well, Gramsci was messing it up, of course, and just turning it into a kind of democratic token resistance. But on the ground, the working class was, as they say in Italy, beginning to move. And meanwhile, the Bolsheviks had an emissary with, you know, talking to Mussolini about foreign trade and things and trade deals. So it's all these contradictory things. But you've also reminded me about how far, and the thing that came out in that article as well, is about the working class being basically militarized. You know, as the situation of isolation wore on in Russia, and so you get more, you know, bulk of the working class, and especially the, you know, class conscious Bolshevik workers were more and more secluded or inside the Red Army rather than inside the Soviets. Yeah. And you know, this just leads to like the sort of this militaristic picture that you can present about even the early days of the Russian Revolution.
It's worse than that. In the end of 1918, there were about 300,000 Bolsheviks, give or take. I think Feiges gives 340,000 or something. By 1920, the bureaucracy, the Slushashi, is 6 million. The Red Army is 5 million. Even if all the Bolsheviks are in them, they have no influence in them. And this was one of Lenin's last sad speeches was about this, that we're not controlling, we are being controlled. And the other thing was that, of course, if 300,000 workers, who are the class-conscious core of the proletariat, end up in the bureaucracy and in the army, what's happened to the proletariat? You know, and certainly for the Bolshevik Party, it was a disaster because it actually detached them from their base. And it was another of the factors of the counter-revolution. I've got back to another cheering fact, haven't I?
Who is the party members going to clash with? Remember this formulation in text?
Oh, yes. Oh, sorry, I forgot about that. Yeah, if I'm right, I'm doing it from memory. It's where I said that a Bolshevik or a communist who is delegated by a group of workers to the Soviet and finds that the Soviet and the party are in disagreement, has to make a choice, either to follow their mandate or to stay with the party and resign their mandate. And that's how the system will work. And that's what I meant was that's what the clash would be between the two kind of thoughts that would go in the head of an individual delegate in that kind of situation.
Yeah, I have no problem with that. That sounds good. Just as
Your microphone's gone.
He's gone.
I think it's gone.
Oh,
can you hear me?
Ah, you're back.
Am I back? Yeah.
Been breaking
I
up.
don't know. This is a bad connection.
Yeah,
I'm breaking up.
yeah, yeah. I thought,
Yeah, I just wanted
I thought
to
Sweden was
make
the
an
most
anecdote.
place.
Yeah, I don't know. My connection is not so good. I just want to tell you something I read once that
Lost you.
have been shot by Russian bullets because the Russian had sold bullets to the German.
oh, this is annoying.
You hear me now?
We heard that.
Ah,
All I heard was Russian Buddhists.
no,
Maybe try
Russian
typing in the
bullets.
chat.
The Bolshevik, the Russian state had sold.
We've lost you again, Anders.
Problem with connection.
The Russian, presumably Soviet state, had sold ammunition to German army,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
so that they were. Is that right, Anders?
Yes, that's the point. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the whole illegal deal after Rapallo was that the German army could train on Russian soil. They actually had the actual original deal was that they were going to build arms factories all across Russia that the Germans were going to manage and the Russians were going to work in, and they were going to produce arms for both countries to get around the Treaty of Versailles. But in actual fact, the Germans decided not to go ahead with it because they thought it was a poor investment.